Every archaeological artifact tells a story. The problem is that those stories don't always make sense to the people who find them, or even to the experts who later study them. Trying to understand the past can often feel like trying to do a jigsaw puzzle in the dark. But with time and effort, we can usually learn something from the process. Let's do a little bit of learning right now. We'll begin with a very controversial archaeological discovery. It's called the Los Lunas Decalogue Stone, which was allegedly found in Mexico in 1933. The controversy around the artifact stems from the fact that it's covered in inscriptions which, to some people, look like they're written in the most ancient form of the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet. Some scholars even claim to have translated the inscription and say that it tells the tale of a man called Zakineros. He was a Greek Cypriot, and he apparently became lost in the Mexican desert after arriving from overseas many centuries before Columbus and even before the Vikings arrived in Newfoundland. The Harvard-educated historian Robert Pfeiffer disagrees, though. He feels the inscription is more likely to be a version of the biblical Ten Commandments. The Decalogue Stone was claimed as a discovery by a man named Frank Hibben, but he says he was gifted it by a tour guide who told him he'd found it while walking alone in the desert decades earlier. The lack of clarity about the artifact's history means it could be a hoax, and many historians would prefer to think of it that way. Sometimes a type of artifact can remain a mystery even when we have hundreds of examples of it. Take the Jomon Dogu, for example, of which countless examples have been discovered in Japan in places like Hokkaido, Kanto, and Chubu. They're products of the Jomon people, who belonged to a culture that disappeared 3,000 years ago. Most of the discovered dolls are at least that old, and some are thought to be far older. Dogu figurines are made from clay, and most of them depict the form of pregnant women. That's led some historians to speculate that they might have been fertility objects, but historians often say that about artifacts they don't understand. To deepen the mystery, it seems that many of the Dogu were deliberately broken before they were buried, which suggests that they were used in an ancient ritual. It's also not uncommon to find them buried in a circular formation, which presumably also has a significance that we don't understand. They clearly had great importance to the Jomon, but we might never know why. The Hill of Tara in Ireland is thought of as one of the most sacred ancient places in the whole of the Emerald Isle, but the reasons why it's thought of as being sacred aren't clear. Most of the stories about it revolve around the stone structure known as Liafel at the top of the hill, most commonly known in folklore as the Stone of Destiny, but also sometimes called the Screaming Stone. Legend has it that the stone would cry out when it was touched by the rightful King of Ireland. The origins of the tale have been lost to time, but it was already a commonly held belief around the time of the coronation of Murtagh MacCrae in the early 6th century. Irish folklore says that the stone was brought to Ireland by a mythical godlike race called the Tuatha De Danann. According to an ancient Irish poem called Lebor Gabala Aran, the ancient king Cuchulainn was so angered by the stone's failure to cry out for him that he split it with his sword, thus ensuring that it would never cry out for any future king. Historians think it's likely that the stone was erected in the Neolithic era for ritual purposes, but yet again the purpose of those rituals isn't known, and we have no way of knowing whether the historians are right. The ancient people who created the Bandiagara escarpment cliff dwellings in Mali didn't build their homes up from the ground. They carved them directly into the sides of cliffs and finished them with elaborate doors made from wood and metal. They're known as Dogon homes, but the Dogon doors tend to get more attention from archaeologists than the primitive dwellings behind them. It's thought that the Dogon people settled here for more than 6 centuries. Over that time, they progressed from creating simple caverns to carving out elaborate mosques, making beautiful decorations from little more than mud and sticks. The thatched roofs they eventually added to their properties are still visible today, standing out clearly from the sides of the 1,500-foot-tall cliffs. The Dogon people still exist in the area, but today their villages are close to the cliffs, rather than inside them. Many of them work as tour guides for foreigners who visit the area, but the secrets of how their ancestors carved out their homes are lost even to them. The entire area is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The Kumbaya artifacts are considered to be among the most important historical objects in Colombia. They're stunning examples of ancient craftsmanship, but they're also claimed by some to be evidence of advanced ancient technology. The artifacts, which are between 2,000 and 3,000 years old, were found close to the capital city of Bogota. There are just over 100 of them in the collection, most of which are clearly representations of animals, insects, fish, and birds. Among the zoomorphic figurines, though, are objects that look a lot like modern planes. The likeness is so uncanny that they even appear to have stabilizers, wings, and fuselages. Academics have made scaled-up versions of the plane-like carvings and demonstrated that they have perfect aerodynamic properties, making them capable of flying through the air like gliders. Nobody is suggesting that these ancient Colombians unlocked the secrets of human flight 3,000 years ago, but their seeming knowledge of aerodynamics ought to have been impossible for people living in that era. It's possible that the shapes had a specific meaning to their creators, and their resemblance to planes is nothing more than a coincidence. But it's a very odd coincidence. Certain groups of scientists could argue all day about whether the Clerksdorp spheres of South Africa are natural or artificial, and they'd never come to any agreement. The argument for them being artificial comes from the fact that they look so much like cricket balls. Many of them are red. Most of them look as if they've been polished, and the majority of them even have a seam running through the middle of them. To those who doubt that they have an artificial origin, though, the spheres are the product of an all-natural process called concretion, and formed on their own over millions of years. South Africa is the only place in the world they've ever been found, and even in South Africa, they're only found at the bottom of deep mines. Some Clerksdorp spheres contain traces of human-made metals, which seems to be compelling evidence for the idea that they were created by human hands. The problem with that is the age of the objects. Many of the Clerksdorp spheres have ages that can be measured in billions rather than millions of years, which makes the idea of human involvement in their creation absurd. Speaking of mysterious ancient stones, let's check out the Inca Stones of Peru, so named because they are only ever found in the country's Ica province. Each Inca stone is made from smooth, polished andesite, and many of them are covered in engravings of animals. They were first brought to the world's attention by the Peruvian scientist Javier Cabrera during the 1960s, by which time he'd already collected over 10,000 examples. Cabrera's obsession with the stones stemmed from the fact that some of the engravings appear to represent dinosaurs. There are even a few that look like humans in spacesuits. Dinosaurs and humans never lived side by side, so the ancient Peruvians who carved the stones shouldn't have had any idea what a dinosaur looked like. Some of Cabrera's peers suspected the scientist had been duped, and when a farmer later admitted faking some of the stones and selling them to Cabrera, the mystery appeared to have been solved. However, the same farmer later confirmed that he didn't forge all 10,000 of them, so the origin of the remaining stones remains unexplained. There are so many stories about the origins of Newport Tower in Newport, Rhode Island, USA, that it's almost impossible to say which of them is true. It's possible that none of them is. The most outlandish tale about the tower is that it was built by Scottish members of the Knights Templar during the 12th century. The tower does have undeniable architectural similarities to Scottish towers from that era, but there's no evidence to support such a claim. Some academics who've studied the tower say that the upper windows are aligned with the stars, and the whole building is an ancient celestial observatory. The evidence to support that idea is also scant. The most likely explanation is that the tower is all that remains of a windmill that was built here during the 1700s, but there isn't much evidence to support that claim either. There ought to be a record of a windmill being built, but there isn't. With other theories involving lost tribes of ancient Portuguese, Norse, or Chinese explorers, the real history of the tower remains a mystery. We're moving back to smaller artifacts now, and we're specifically talking about the Acambaro figurines. The figurines, which are really little more than tiny clay dolls, represent animals, people, and humanoid figures which aren't quite human or animal. They're thought of as being among the most incredible examples of ancient art from the South American continent, and are attributed to the Chupacuaro culture of ancient Mexico. That would make the figurines approximately 2,400 years old, but believing that theory also involves believing the tale of their discovery. The official narrative is that a German archaeologist by the name of Waldemar Jilsrud found the figurines close to the mountains of Acambaro in 1945. There are some who think he lied, and he carved the figurines himself. Doubters of Jilsrud's story point out that some of the figurines look like dinosaurs, which would have been unknown to the ancient Mexicans, and also the fact that the figurines show little sign of being damaged or weathered, despite allegedly being left on a mountainside for more than 2 millennia. Jilsrud always insisted that the artifacts were genuine, and continued to do so even on his deathbed. So who are we to doubt him? The Dorchester pot wouldn't be thought of as unique if it weren't for the circumstances of its discovery. It's similar in size, shape, and design to the kind of candlestick holder that was popular in Victorian England, although it's also been pointed out that it looks a little like a 19th century Indian pipe holder. Despite that, there are people who believe that the artifact is more than 500 million years old. Why? Because that's the age of the layer of rock that had just been broken in half by an explosion when the Dorchester pot was allegedly found. It was discovered during mining operations in Dorchester, Massachusetts, USA in 1852, and was apparently thrown clear of an explosion that took place 15 feet within the surface of a Precambrian layer of rock. The question of how a 19th century object came to be inside a prehistoric layer of rock cannot be answered, so perhaps the most likely explanation is that it was never inside the rock in the first place. It was simply near it and was broken in half by the force of the explosion. Sometimes the dull explanations are the ones that hold the most water. The Fuente Magna bowl is just as controversial as the Dorchester pot, but at least in the case of the Fuente Magna bowl, most experts can agree that it's a genuine ancient artifact. What they can't agree on is whether the bowl is America's answer to the Rosetta Stone. The bowl is, in basic terms, a ceramic drinking vessel covered in elaborate patterns and inscriptions. It's been claimed by some that these inscriptions are, in fact, an early Sumerian form of writing called cuneiform. The mystery isn't helped by the fact that the Fuente Magna bowl's provenance is so dubious. It was apparently found by a farmer near the Bolivian site of Pumapunku in 1950, but was then used for feeding pigs until the 1970s. From there, it somehow found its way to a museum, where one Dr. Clyde Winters proclaimed that the inscriptions on the side of the vessel were Sumerian, and the very existence of the artifact proves the ancient Sumerians traveled across the seas all the way to Bolivia. it's more likely that it's a product of the Tiwanaku civilization, and the patterns are nothing more than decorations. Our next set of artifacts is known as the Tucson Artifacts because they were found close to Tucson, Arizona in 1924. They're also variously known as the Silver Bell Road Artifacts and the Tucson Crosses. Whatever name you want to call them, they're an ancient metal mystery. The treasure trove of 31 artifacts was discovered by Charles E. Maynier while out walking and comprises Christian-style crosses, metal artifacts shaped like short swords, and a few other objects which might be religious in nature. The strangest thing about the entire collection is the presence of a dinosaur engraved on the blade of one of the swords. Given that the supposed date of origin for the Tucson artifacts is the 8th century, the presence of a dinosaur design ought to be impossible. Between the dinosaur and the poor quality of the Latin inscriptions on some of the other artifacts, it's no wonder that many historians have written the discovery off as a hoax. To those who still believe in their veracity, though, the Tucson artifacts are evidence of Judeo-Christian settlers arriving in Arizona 1,200 years ago. Why those settlers would know about dinosaurs is something that even the fringe theorists can't explain.
Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching and see you soon!